Okay, so welcome to our Bible class midweek. We're starting into the book of Ecclesiastes. And tonight we'll do an overview of the book and look at some major points about it, some observations of the book. And then I've got some handouts I'll be producing that'll be back here in the back. If you've got any comments, do have the comments up if you want to add comments, if you're live with us this evening. If you're not, you can drop them in. The comments will also come to me and be able to respond to them. Okay, so if we take an observation overall and look at the book of Ecclesiastes, we'll get to who the writer is, but as from his point of view, one of the things that we see is it's his own loss for his enthusiasm for life. It's kind of this strange relationship that he's come to, or point in his life. And I've often thought, that Solomon, which we know, all believe, we'll get to it, who the author is, it's kind of like he hit that midlife crisis where, we get to a point in our lives and we start looking around and we start questioning, what's going on. And so it's that point of losing that enthusiasm for life. I think everyone has reached that point in our lives where we get to that point where you just wonder a lot of things. And so he's recording them as he's searching for this meaning. There's something missing. And so he's searching for this meaning and why he has lost that enthusiasm. And that's kind of the foundation of things that we're going to see that he starts to unveil in this as he sets forward, his final conclusions. And one of the things is that when we look at the name itself is interesting, Ecclesiastes. It never was labeled until the Septuagint was written, and the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Torah. And so all the law, the prophets that were written prior to about 265, I think, is when the Septuagint was written. And so it wasn't called, it was called the preacher or other things, but it was the actual committee or the 72 who put together the Bible in the Septuagint, which is the Greek. And it actually is the same document that Jesus and the apostles used. That's where this name came up. And it means one who calls the assembly. And so the writer identifies himself. We see several ways he does it without ever really even using his name. In verse 1:1, he says, a king in Jerusalem, hint, hint, wisest person who had ever ruled over Jerusalem, 1:16, builder of great projects, chapter 2, 4, and 6, a man of much wealth, chapter 2:8, possessor of large harem, 2:8. So you see these references, and it really does come down to there's only one person that it could be, even though he never mentions the name. It's got to be Solomon. We look at the date. It's interesting because it's like 30 centuries ago. 30 centuries ago, this book was written, and yet we see the power of the wisdom that it has is timeless. It's like the book of Proverbs. When we looked at that book of Proverbs, there are so many things that you really can't improve on. There's nothing that we can write that would be a better Ecclesiastes, something that would explain the meaning of life and all the aspects that he's going to cover. And so it's just, to me, 30 centuries of wisdom. I think it helps to point to this idea of how that this is a unique book over all of these other type of wisdom books, and it's fitting for this, this inspired book to be included in it. Looking at the theme, I think a lot of us understand this word comes up if you've read even just a few verses in the book of Ecclesiastes, is vanity of vanities, vanity. Now to us, when you say that word, vanity, what does that mean? When somebody says vanity. in today's language, vain, proud. Somebody who is, we apply that more in a common usage of saying somebody, man, that person is so vain and they're proud. And that's not the meaning of what this is in the context of the way it's being used. It actually comes from the word breath. And I liken it to, like James says, that life is like a vapor. And what is the value of it? What is the value of a vapor, of breath? There's not a real worthiness or worthness. So it is associated more with meaningless, metaphorically, to this idea that it has no real purpose to it. And so it's still, I think most understand what he's reading. If you study the book, you understand that it's not talking about pride, a proud person, but the idea that it's vain in trying to achieve, but it's even more, it's a cheapness or meaninglessness of life. And so that really is chapter 1, 2, verse 2 is where he talks about that. And so, Solomon sets his mind in verses 1 through 13. So we're going to go through kind of an overview, and then we're going to come back and we'll do a few of the verses of chapter 1 and tie it in tonight. So what does he say? He says in verses 1, 13, and 14, this idea of, and I set my mind to seek and explore wisdom by concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. So he says, I'm seeking after all these wisdom. It's like he is this. I don't know if you've seen movies where a lot of times the movie will start out and it starts with the ending of the story. And then it'll say 3 years earlier, and then the rest of the movie is about the 3 years earlier. You already saw the ending, and then they go back and tell you, well, how did they get there? And that's kind of the way that Solomon has wrote this, is he's wrote it in a way of showing, here's my conclusion, but then he's going to go in and explain it and show how he came to that point. And so his overall conclusion really, and this is important, for a man without God, life, when you examine it, it's going to be found useless. When man without God, then our life, when we take a look at it, is really useless without God. That is really kind of the key thing of what he has come to in this conclusion. There's a lot of things that he found, a lot of philosophies of that day and age that were trying to substitute this meaning, because when you have without God, what we have found is society is filling it with something. Because there's something inside us that has been created by God for us to have that desire. That there's something lacking, something missing. And that's why when you're a little child, maybe at some point in your life, before you understood much, maybe, I'm talking like a toddler or 8, 9 years old, and you look up and you see the stars, or you go to a funeral and you have this epiphany by yourself without being told by your parents that, wow, there's something becomes overwhelming to you. And that's that desire of saying, there's something that I lack, something I'm desiring, something bigger out there than just this existence right now. And it grows within us. And so that is this quest that Solomon goes for. Now he tells us now in the conclusion that he has found it, and that is that a life without God is no value. It's useless. So how do we do that today when we look at some of these modern, I call them, it's probably not very proper, but we look at what I call modern Ecclesiastes, or things that are trying to actually fill, like he talks about pursuing money and pursuing different things and doing it to its best, but it was lacking. So today I kind of group together some things that when we look at them is that we're using, people who don't have God in their lives is using. And the first one is materialism. Only stuff is real. That's what it's all about. Money, toy, trips, titles. That's what fills you up. That's what satisfies you. There used to be an old I don't know if it was a bumper sticker or a poster. It used to say, the man, at the end of his life, the man with more toys wins, or something like that. It's like, it almost reflected that. It was like, the more toys you have at the end of your life, the more material things, then you win. But these are things that are trying to substitute in something in their life that's lacking. And that lacking can only really be fulfilled with God. And so materialism we see. And the key verse is Ecclesiastes 5:10. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. How many times have we in our lives, as we grow up, we just keep thinking that somehow, if I can get a better job and get more money, that it's going to fix my problems and life will be easier. And all we seem to do is turn around and find out that now I'm spending more or whatever's going on, but it didn't satisfy. It still was lacking something there. The next one is also developing what you want. Existentialism. Make your own meaning. You create it. It's something that, I'm a self-made, meaning, but the problem with that is, how do you justify and beat guilt, injustice, or death? You try to say, well, I'm a self-made person. I exist in my own world. I sustain myself. I make me who I am. I'm a self-made man. We hear that a lot. And so, again, that's the second one. Like I said, the problem with self-made, meaning, you can't get around guilt. You can't undo justices by making yourself better. There are just some things that will always be outside your grasp. If you try to say, well, I create my own. I can create my own. And that is a delusion in thinking somehow that I can create. If I just wish it'll happen, or I can shape myself. So these are, again, some of these modern ways people are substituting when they don't have God. They don't have God in their life. The next one is, I call it positivism. If you can't measure it, it isn't real. Materialism. In other words, it's got to be literal. It's something that I have to have positive fact, proof. And if you can't measure it, you can't study it, then it's not real. And that's kind of crazy because, there's a lot of important things that you can't see that exist. They're trying to, there's parts that, we just don't understand. Again, you can't measure everything. And even in our measurements, if we were to talk about, for example, I just saw this documentary, and it was an amazing one about these World War II aircraft that were trying to make it over to Germany during the war, and they had to turn around because of weather, and they were flying back over the Arctic, and they had to make an emergency landing because they were running out of fuel. They couldn't see where they're landing, so they landed, and it was a flight of aircraft that landed, and they just forgot it. They abandoned the planes. 40 years go by. And they thought, let's go recover those for a historical reason. And so they thought, well, where are they at? And they found them, but they figured, well, how far are they? Because they couldn't see them. They were buried. Well, according to science said that the polar caps, only increase at a certain rate. Therefore, these aircraft should only be so many feet buried. They were over 260 feet buried. According to the scientific information on how polar caps accumulate snow and snowpack, there's no way. We knew they were only in the ice for 40 years. So we see carbon dating, we see a lot of different things, a lot of things that we use, and we say, well, these are absolute, this is the way you measure something. And we find that, no, that's not really accurate, and they have to adjust. And that's fine, I don't have a problem with that. But if you're trying to fill your life with this positivism and this, you have to have this evidence, then there's a lot of things, again, righteousness and eternity, how do you measure those things? You can't. And the next one is, let me back up, I already had it there. It's what I call postmodernism. And this is what really affects a lot of people, and that's where we talk about the idea of no single truth. It's just a perspective. It's relative. What you believe is right is relative to what I believe is right. So there's no single truth. Everything is your truth, and no one can call evil evil. Well, I think we have some realistic examples, especially today in our age, that really do show that that just creates chaos, doesn't it? It's created nothing but chaos in our lives. This idea that there's no single truth, just the way you're looking at stuff. Again, this is all about trying to substitute God. And so a life without God, you find these four things, philosophies or ideologies that people will use to satisfy what God has put in us, to know that we're not satisfied with things in this world. And we'll talk a little more about that. When we look at the overview of the outline of the book, the way he started it, he introduces this journey, verses chapter 1 through 11. And that's what we're really going to look at tonight, focus in on those verses in a little bit. But the idea here is that, the journey of life, it's wearisome. It's endless repetition of events that are meaningless when you really look at it. And he ends with that conclusion. Before he even begins, he starts out by letting us know what he has found. And then he, like I said, he's going to go in and talk more about it. The second part, 1:12 through chapter 6:9, is pursuing this journey that Solomon's going to go through and try to seek out. And the first one, chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, is this pursuit of knowledge and wisdom, which ends in much grief and increasing pain. And 2, verses 1 through 11, pleasure. Many paths of pursuing pleasure. We see that today. And acquiring possessions, you know what? It's not profitable. It's not going to give you that satisfaction. And then we see the pursuit of wisdom and folly, chapter 2, 12 through 17. To live wisely or foolishly, he's going to conclude and say, you know what? What happens to both of them? They die. So there's a folly in that, no matter whether it's foolishness or wisdom. We're all going to come to the end of our lives and go to the same place. We have that same eventual end. And then 4:1 through the rest of 6:9 about wealth and power. Well, I'm sorry, 2, we look at work, the pursuit of work, chapter 2, 18 through chapter 3, 22, looking at work. The work ethic is examined. And again, it also, what is it full of? It's full of grief and emptiness. We call it burnout. You can work and you start out refreshed and you feel like you're being satisfied and you're accomplishing things, but at the end of it, what was it for? A lot of people, when they go to retire, they look back at their lives and they go, I spent so many years doing what? And what was that all for? What was it for? What was the value in that? And a lot of times it's terrible because some of the people who, again, are trying to pursue these to substitute a life without God find that there's a lot of harm that they can't undo. And especially when it comes to their family relationships. When it comes to the relationships, instead of taking care of the way God has established, if God was in your life, your family would be more of a focus. And so after they hit this retirement or we hit a certain point, we look around and all that I've been chasing after and working so hard for, what was it for? My kids are gone and they hate me. What was that all about? Again, we're talking about, so you don't get too depressed, this is a life without God. That's his point, that everything is really of no value as we pursue after these things of this pursuit of wisdom, pleasure, wisdom and folly. And none of these, he's saying, especially like wisdom, and a lot of this is not that they're sinful, it's just that without God, they're worthless. Okay? They're worthless. Work is good. He'll talk about that. It's what God intended, to be satisfied with it. But without God, it's frustrating. It's just emptiness, always. And so even as he closes it out with wealth and power, You know, the idea that no matter how much power you accomplish and wealth, you know, where are all of our famous people? Where do they go? Where are all the criminals? You know, they all go to the same place. Your power, no matter how much power you accomplish, where is it? You know, I kind of think about that with all the living presidents. You know, when you look at them and they're out, you know, and how it's almost sometimes you hear in some of their comments or their speeches, it's like, what was all that for? Where's my power now? You know, they try to find a way to reinvigorate themselves in life, and either going on speeches or writing books or certain things. But that to me is one where we can see somebody who has achieved such a high level, and then they got to get out. They got to move on. Get her out, and then what was their life all about? And so, again, without God, it's absolutely, it is meaningless. And so, next one is looking at this idea of reflection and summary as he closes up the book. And that's what he starts with, and that's what he's going to basically end with. So let's talk about Solomon a little bit before we go on and look at this. Solomon, most of us know a lot about Solomon. We've heard some sort of story or another. I think there's very few people today that doesn't know about the Bible character Solomon. His father was David. His mother, bonus point, who was his mom? Bathsheba. And so, anyway, David, he fought all the battles. David had basically defeated all the enemies, and then they were living in extreme prosperity at the end of David's life, and had all this money and wealth that had been normally funneled off to wars and other projects and stuff. And so we hit a point when Solomon comes along that there's a lot of peace and prosperity that he's going to. And so he invests a lot of those riches into projects. And then, of course, that's one of the things he describes is that I was like the richest there was. And I use that, in a sense, to go out and to experiment and to have this. So, and yet, he said, you know, these various pursuits that I did without God were wasted. They were a waste. Now, we know that Solomon wasn't the most spiritual all his life. Started out really well, right? I mean, he started out in one of the most amazing ways in the very first days of his ruling, when God came to him and asked him, you know, Solomon, ask me for anything. Remember that? Solomon said what? Give me wisdom to be able to know how to rule your people. And God said, I'm not only going to do that, but I'm going to make you the wisest man of all, and I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for. So, but as time, and that's why it's interesting how he is kind of writing this book in reflection, looking back on his life, and he went off on the deep end. I mean, he started experimenting with all sorts of things, and then some of the most horrible things he was doing was bringing in all these pagan gods. And they actually building them for all the wives he had from all the foreign nations, which God had forbade them to have. Build them right there across from the temple. Mm-hmm. The Jews actually started calling it the Hill of Abomination because that hill used to have a temple for all the pagan gods of Solomon's wives. So, and he worshiped them. He sacrificed to them. So it's just kind of mind-blowing, isn't it, that to see a man that's so wise go down that road. And now we come and read this book, and it's almost like, here's the other side of this story. This is the effects of what I did and the consequences. And I found out basically that all that I was doing and pursuing and accomplishing and enjoying still was not satisfying. There was just something missing. And that's the thing that a lot of people fail to understand, is you're going to accomplish a lot of things in the world, but if it's without God, you're going to feel like you haven't accomplished everything. You're going to have something missing, and it's just, you're going to lack that in your life, and that's what's hard. So we start in on verses 1 through 3. He says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of all vanities. All is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work in which he does under the sun? And that's what I mean. He reached a point, he was the most accomplished ruler in wealth and everything, and yet he looks around and he says there's no value in everything. Now, some definitions here. When he says under the sun, he's talking about in this physical world. In this world, in this physical life that we're living, he's saying, so there's no value, he's crying out. There's just no value. So what value does a man have? What advantage does a man have in all the work that he does while he's alive? In all that you accomplish, what's going to be that? So he has 4 things that he's going to establish on the onset of this as he concludes, but he's going to start this out by showing us the 4 things, and then he's going to dive deeper as we get into the book. After he identifies himself, we see and shows us this premises of the book, and when all that he has accomplished, there's nothing left that was still satisfying him. You know, we always look at people like that, don't we? We do. We look at people who seem to be accomplishing dreams and education or career paths, and they have all these cars, and they seem to have these retirement security, and their family are just beautiful and functioning, and then we want that. It's like, well, if I had that, I could have that happiness. But I think if we all really thought about it, we know that there's a lot of people that are accomplished in many things, and they are so miserable.
Yes, there it is.
All you got to do is look at Hollywood.
That's right. Yep.
I mean, they put themselves out there, okay? So they've got glamour, they've got fame, they've got money, they've got choice restaurants they can go to. They can go to the Bahamas, to Greece, and fly around, and you know, people want their autographs, and yet look at them.
They ain't got no happiness.
No happiness.
Yep.
Suicide, drug abuse, you know, divorces, children. Look at their families. And that's that point. That's kind of like Solomon. He said, I was that. And I saw I was not satisfied. And I think that's where we should be sad for people in those situations, because they have taken those things and tried to fill God and take God out, thinking that they could satisfy themselves. And they're not. It's not working, because there is a God. So the first one is this idea of generation and generation and generation and generation, you know, that keeps coming in verse 1:4. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. You know, people, are they just born to die? You know, I mean, I kind of, you know, the older you get, you start looking around and you start thinking about that. I mean, I just look at being here with this congregation for so many years and living in this town and all my family, and then I look at my grandfather and all them, and it just seems like, wait a minute, now I'm the old guy. Like, whoo, you know, now I'm him. You know, it's like, I had a cousin tell me, goes, you know what, we're the oldest herrings in the family. We're the oldest male herrings now. And I'm like, what? So we, the old guys, that when we were little, we'd always look up and go, oh, old Uncle Grover, you know, and we're like, you know, now I'm him. And soon I won't be. And so that's that futility when you look at, where are your grandparents at? Where are your parents at? Where are your great-grandparents at? You know, generation comes, a generation goes. A generation comes, a generation goes. But the earth just keeps turning. So that's the first one that he pulls out. The other one is he uses the idea of the cycles of nature and how that continues in verse 5 and 6. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and it hastens to its place, and it rises again, blowing toward the south and then turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, and yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, they will flow again. All things are worrisome. Man is not able to tell it. Can't explain it. The sun just keeps coming up and the sun's going down. Sun coming up, sun goes down. It's just, again, I want to keep bringing this up. If this physical world is all you have, then it's pretty worthless. Mm-hmm. It's it's full of vanity, like what he is talking about. And these are great illustrations, isn't it, of the life that seems to be flying around us. We can see it in nature. Daylight savings time's coming up. It's getting shorter in the day. It's going to get darker, right? And we can look at the end of October and guess what happens? We're going to get like our first freeze. And then we can go through it. And then when do we have our monsoons? Well, we just left our monsoons. Guess what? Next summer, hopefully we get a monsoon. It just comes. All my life we just see this. And it's like, and again, people who don't have God, they don't have the same hope. And so life has that lack of value. The next one he points out is this idea of the curiosity of man. And I think God put this in us. This is where mankind has this curiosity. And God loves that in us. He created us in this. And there's a beautiful part. But again, without God, it's not satisfied. And that's what he says in the first part of 8. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. A man's curiosity arouses and he seeks the answers, right? But it seems like the more that he asks questions and the more he knows, he asks more questions. It just seems to create more questions. And the dark matter in the universe now. They apparently somehow are able to sit and calculate the volume of all the stars and matter somehow. It blows my mind. I'm not that smart. But they figured out that somehow they're missing a bunch. But wait a minute, there's a whole lot that doesn't add up if you take all these stars. And then all of a sudden they start looking, they go, well, there's this other stuff. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, there's this dark, and we're asking, we're seeking. But then there's going to be something else. There'll be something else. There's this curiosity. There's no end to that satisfaction. There's something there. And this next one, the idea of that, there's absent of something new. And that's true. I think we forget that. In 9 and 10, he says, that which has been is that which will be. And that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see, it is new. Already it exists for ages, which were before us. So, there is this idea that we struggle with. And he continues in verse 11. He says, there is no remembrance of earlier things. And also after the later things which will occur, there will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. How did the Egyptians build the pyramids? Boy, that's been the billion-dollar question in all sorts of differences. Like those primitive people, how could they build something so precise? Some of the things we see that were built in South America, the precision of the cuts, these massive tons of rock that was cut precisely and positioned. It's like they were just simple folk back then. We can't do that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think of this. Why do you think that it's out of their level? Because one, we don't remember. There was a lot of things that happened that destroyed, and so this idea, there's no remembrance of earlier things is what made me think of this. And that's why the pyramids jumped out, because ancient astronauts, right? Aliens came and taught them and built this for them and all this stuff. And it's like, no, it's simpler than that. They did it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's what but we don't remember. We forget. And so we think somehow, oh, this is so new. I mean, look at this. And basically what he's saying is, no, you're just explaining something that has always been. Like gravity. Gravity's always been around until that guy with the apple, right? And then he dropped it. But so is that new? Is gravity new? No. No. He put a formula to it and explained it. You know, it's like, no. It's like the idea of, you know, the way that they describe the planets. You know, that somehow that initially the Earth was a center and everything spun around it. And they had, oh man, if you look at some of those models that they came up with, the different gyration of the planets and how they go around, and then whenever they decide, wait a minute, no, maybe the sun's the center, you know, I think they crucified the guy, they burned him. It's like, no, that's witchcraft, you can't do that. You know, it's like, well, it didn't change the fact, did it? That the sun is the center of the universe. We just were able to discover it and describe it. And that's what science is. Science really is taking something that has already existed, already been there. Yep. It's not new.
That's right.
Black holes have been out there. Dark matter, if it is a real thing, and I think it is, it's been out there. So that's the thing, is that it's kind of, but we feel like that. We feel, because why? You know, this idea of feeling like things are futile, you know, the passing of generations, you know, the cycles of nature, you know, the curiosity of man. These things in the absence of something new. We really see that when it comes to beliefs in God. Trying to create a new God. Trying to create all these different things, and there's not. So I think what we're seeing that's lacking, that Solomon's trying to bring out, is that for every universal, innate need of a man, there is something available and corresponding to satisfy it. In other words, if there's a desire that we have in the physical world, there's something that we can satisfy it with. But there's something deeper that we're seeking after these things and thinking that that's the whole of happiness, of value. You know, so, you know, for everything there is, for hunger, there's food. You know, there's all these things we have that we can find that correspond to it. And where I'm going with this is kind of interesting because in C.S. Lewis's book called Surprised by Joy, and it's kind of his journey of how he became a Christian, I got an excerpt from his book. And this is his thinking. And it was a man who was very intelligent, seeking out this satisfaction and joy that he's lacking, that no matter what he accomplished, it just wasn't happening. And listen to what he said. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger? Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim? There's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire? Well, there's such a thing as sex. I find myself a desire with no experience in this world can satisfy. The most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. That's so deep. For everything an animal has a desire for, even humans, there's something in this physical world that we can satisfy with it. But he said, I find I have this desire where nothing I can experience in this world can satisfy it. And that caused him to think that the most probable explanation is that, well, maybe there's something outside this world. Hence, God. You see? And maybe that's the purpose, he said. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it. But instead, and I think this is powerful, only to arouse it, to create within you that knowledge that you know you're not meant for this world. You can't get that same, no matter how physically in this world you're getting these satisfactions, there's just one you're not getting. And that's what Solomon is saying. Without God, it's never going to be satisfied. Everything you satisfy on those desires are going to become meaningless. So he goes on, he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven on this earth. It's a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. You know, what seemed like an interesting life experience that he was going to involve himself in, he discovers that it just ended up being unhappiness, and that it didn't satisfy. He thought that this life, this wild life of adventure, he would be able to discover it. And he's saying no. And so he says, all of that. And that's where this same thing, what C.S. Lewis was saying. Solomon is kind of bringing this up. He's bringing it up that, look, you know, I was satisfying with all these things. Every desire I had, like C.S. Lewis said, I satisfied it. I had a desire, I satisfied it. But then when it came to it, there's something I wasn't satisfied. Something which, as C.S. Lewis would say, is outside this world. That should create within us a desire to what? Seek God. Seek God. So what did he learn? One, all lifestyles are meaningless. And in a lot of ways, they're equal. Now, he's not devaluating, okay? Again, let's keep it in that context. He's not devaluating a plumber from a lawyer. He's not necessarily talking about that. He's just meaning that there's a certain level of equality of value that we try to place on these things to seem like that's what's going to be of more value. But no, he said, I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun on this world, and behold, it's all vanity and striving after wind. At the end of the day, no matter if you're a doctor, you go to the same house, you go to a different house, maybe your house is better built and stuff, but you have families, you have all these other things going on. It doesn't make that person have a more meaningful life. It all comes out equal, and that equality comes through death. There's a lot of things, he says, can't be changed. In verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. You know, we keep trying to develop anti-gravity machines. And I don't know, maybe we will, but there are just some things that Solomon said that, you know what, you're not going to be able to change it. And I think that trying to find a satisfying life outside of God is one of those that you cannot change. You're not going to be able to change somehow and make a satisfied life, a truly satisfied life, without God. And he says the same thing with knowledge. He says, I said to myself, behold, and I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this is also striving after the wind. He comes to that same conclusion, that all this knowledge at some point doesn't mean anything. When somebody reaches the end of their lives, if they're blessed enough to know maybe, or cursed, I don't know, depends on how you value your life, but if you come to a point in your life where you're coming to the end of it, you might look back, and a lot of people go, man, I wish I would have done something else, because I'm always lacking. There's always like, I could have done more, I could have done better, I could have done, should have done. And that's a person that doesn't have God. A Christian goes, let's go, bro. Let's go, Lord. I'm ready to go. Because I want to be fully satisfied with something this world cannot give me.
That's right.
And that's what he's saying when he talks about lifestyles and knowledge and things like that. And this idea of, I've seen this, you know, where a lot of people, the more they know, the crazier they get. And he says, because in much wisdom is much grief, and much increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. I don't know if you know the history of like the theory of relativity and Einstein going back to the 1800s, and the scientists that were working towards that, and the competition, and there's a lot of things that went on that if you go back and look, Einstein, without another man's computations that cracked through, and he kind of used those to build his theory that he'd become famous with, But there was a lot of stress in these guys' life trying to quest after it more. So you look at them, they're geniuses, look at it, but even they, in that quest, there was a lot of pain, a lot of misery that was there. So it's not something. And a lot of times it's because the more knowledge you have, the more complex your questions become as well. You start digging deeper. And again, there are just some things, you know what? Only God knows. There are just some things we'll never know. And it was meant that way. That's why you won't. And if you're trying to satisfy yourself, yeah, you're going to have a lot of pain. You're just going to have a lot of pain because God isn't going to tell you. He is not going to reveal it to us. And if you have God in your life, well, you just love the knowledge you got. You live with God and you glorify Him through it. So I think as we wrap this up tonight, we look at the main lesson. They're just some things that we cannot know. They're not going to be found or satisfied in this earth. And so the rest of the book is going to be now going into those different topics. So that's the end of this lesson. Any closing thoughts, comments, or? Okay, well, thank you for joining the class. We hope you can join us this Sunday morning at 9:45 for Bible study. Also at 10:45 for worship, 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Next Wednesday, we will not be able to live stream, but we'll be having classes. And so if you got questions, get a hold of me, let me know. Tell them. So it'll be like 2 weeks, we'll get to lesson number 2. Until then, well, God bless. We'll see you then.